Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, and hello to our global audiences. Welcome to the Atlantic Council Office, Bucharest, Romania. This week, from Bucharest to Warsaw to Prague, this week's Atlantic Council flagship event, Central Europe Week, aims to elevate the visibility of the region's challenges and opportunities in the transatlantic community. Last evening, we convened our dinner with industry experts and government to discuss hybrid threats, cybersecurity risks, and resilience. Today's public event, US-Europe Relations in an Age of Uncertainty, followed by an expert panel, Disinformation, Elections, and Democratic Resilience, are kicking off this week's trek across the region, brought to you by the Europe Center in the Atlantic Council and our offices in Poland and Bucharest. Since our opening in June last year, our 4 pillars of activity, energy and infrastructure, technology and artificial intelligence, defense and security, and last but not least, European integration and democracy, have taken us from Bucharest to Washington, to Warsaw, to Athens, to New York, and back to Bucharest, across many events that bridge the transatlantic gap and the transatlantic relations in these areas. Without further ado, it is now my pleasure to give the floor to my partner today, the Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, Jorn Fleck. Jorn?
Thank you so much, Alex, and warm greetings to everyone, to our in-person audience here, to our virtual audience online. I'm delighted to also welcome you to the public launch event of the 2026 Central Europe Week conference, our flagship on all things Central Europe. After our opening of the office here in Bucharest in June 2025 last year, we're delighted to not only bring Central Europe Week to Romania for the first time in the conference's 7-year history, but to actually kick off this year's edition here in Romania before heading, as Alex already said, to Warsaw and Prague. And so each year the conference focuses on the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and highlighting their critical role in the transatlantic partnership. And we're delighted to kick things off here in Bucharest, not least given Romania's growing strategic importance for Southeastern Europe, for the Black Sea region, but also more broadly for Europe and the transatlantic partnership. Today's event really continues a broader Atlantic Council investment in Central and Eastern Europe. Alex already mentioned the launch of the office last year under his excellent leadership and with the help of tremendous partners from Romania on our Romania Advisory Council. We also relaunched our Warsaw office in 2022. And this is all a commitment to being present and active as a trusted partner, the Atlantic Council, across this region for the long term. Even before we opened our offices across the region, the Council has been a strong advocate for a Europe whole, free, prosperous, and secure, none of which would be possible without Central Europe. In many ways, Russia and its malign actions throughout this region were the original motivation and a driving force behind our commitment. Romania obviously understands that threat better than most and how to counter it, especially as the Black Sea becomes a critical arena of transatlantic security more broadly. Of course, the challenge before us and areas where this region can lead expand well beyond security. Economically, for example, Europe has been searching for an answer to solve its competitiveness problems, and as some of the fastest growing, most digitally savvy, and most free market-oriented economies, Central European countries can bring desperately needed energy to fuel that transformation, address those challenges. In addition, and last but not least, this region can also play and will play a critical role in reshaping a changing transatlantic relationship. Capitals across the region have been ahead of the pack in Europe when it comes to addressing a whole series of challenges that have also been identified in Washington as priorities, and that is from stepping up defense spending and investing in military capabilities, to confronting Chinese influence and technologies, to prioritizing energy independence and infrastructure build-out. So drawing on all of these areas, Romania is a leading example from the region of how to build influence that it can use to strengthen the transatlantic relationship at a moment of profound change for the alliance. And leveraging its unique experience, Romania can drive this partnership towards a rebalanced, but ultimately, we believe, more robust and resilient version of its past self. So with this event, with this in mind, I couldn't think of a better way to kick off today's event than by hearing from one of the leading strategic thinkers in shaping Romania's foreign policy, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Emil Hureșanu. A warm welcome. Delighted to have you here, Minister. Before I turn the floor over to our Wiser Family Distinguished Fellow Ambassador Dan Fried to moderate the conversation, let me encourage all of you here and online to follow along with the rest of this week's Central Europe Week. You can look at public discussions on issues from economic security and defense to the state of U.S. policy in Europe, which you can tune into by visiting us on X at AC Europe. That's at AC Europe, or on LinkedIn. And with that, thank you all again for joining us here in the room today, online. And I look forward to a great discussion and a great Central Europe Week. With that, Ambassador, Minister, over to you. Welcome to the stage.
I was reading your biography, preparing for this, and what struck me is that you and I both spent the 1980s working on the issues and consequences of Europe's division, the Iron Curtain, which was the result of a line drawn between two dictators, Mr. Hitler and Mr. Stalin, and a line that could be drawn because the United States was absent from Europe. That's on us.
Up to a certain point.
Up to a certain point. But we were absent in the 1930s. So I was thinking about that because it has struck me many times that our old adversaries of the 20th century are back in a way. Aggressive tyrants. One threatening Europe, another potentially threatening in Asia. And the United States is again debating its role in the world and revisiting arguments that in my youth I thought were banished. So it's a tough time. And I wanted to ask about your perspective, not just as a Romanian, but as a Romanian of that generation that helped bring Europe and Romania from division and poverty to part of a united Europe and growing prosperity. I can't fully share the pessimism of many because, like you, I started thinking about Europe when it was divided, and many people thought the division would last forever, forever. And I remember what Bucharest looked like when I first came here in 1979, or what it looked like after Ceausescu got through with it in the early 90s. So I wanted to ask you to try to put what we're going through in Europe and in transatlantic relations in that broader context. It turns out we knew a lot of the same people at RFERF, right? My friends, your colleagues. And our work is still relevant, but I wanted to ask you for your assessment. And my guess is that you're gonna have questions for me too. Tough questions, but fair ones. Anyway, I wanted to get your perspective, and it's great to
Thank you so much,
get a chance
Ambassador.
to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Treat for changing the roles. Not usually, I'm the one who puts questions. As a trained journalist, you mentioned my stay to the Radio Free Europe in the 80s and afterwards, after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 90. Let me salute at the very beginning your presence in Bucharest for kicking off this triangle conversation, which for once begins in Bucharest. Bucharest, Warsaw, and Prague, the Central European conversation, which is good to take place. Then you are, and you know very well this, but still for our audience, I would like to mention it once again. Most senior Ivy League diplomacy mandarins starting in the 80s and then working hard and closely for us, with us in the 90s, in 2000 up to now. I'm just having a walk before the beginning of this conference. I've seen a plaque commemorating the 4 visits by Pilsudski in Romania in the 20s and 30s. So, like Pilsudski, you visited only this year 5 times, I think, in the 2 years of Romania, which is good. It remembered me his eastern flank plan immediately after the First World War, Mare Nostrum. So you are prompt, I think, to these ideas, and I'm following your interviews with radio, with TV Polska in English.
Yeah.
Which you're very kindly giving to this Australian guy, and where you stress the importance of this Eastern flank. I think it is one of the pillars of our present history, which continues what happened during the 80s, in the 90s, and so on and so forth. Now back to your question. We are rather hostage to this Kulturpessimismus, as the Germans, who invented the concept, as you well know, call it. Well, all of a sudden we feel we felt lost during the last year, after the inauguration. Failure after failure within our bilateral relation with the US administration, and then some lack of practical dialogue, of improvements, of encouragement from the US to us. I'm rather for broadening the context. We're owing so much to the US after the First World War, the 14 points declaration of President Woodrow Wilson, and we were owing to this declaration our integrity of our country nowadays, less or less. Then we know what happened after 45. We've been on this side of the Iron Curtain, belonging to the Russian larger camp, communist bloc. Okay, after Yalta, you did not sell us at Yalta, as we all know. You insisted, the American side insisted for free elections in Poland. What Stalin did was the contrary of what he agreed. This is not the first time, was not the last time the Russian leaders practiced this kind of diplomatic foul play. Then, at the beginning of 50s, you invented this great operation, which is called Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who was not only a surrogate of telling the truth with broadcasting towards the Eastern European countries into the Soviet Union, but also a memento of your presence with us, of your participation at the real socialist or communist worries of the people. In the 80s, Romania happened to be one of the most the worst governed countries within the Eastern Bloc, being a kind of open-minded partner of the US at the end of the 60s. That's why he visited probably this country in '79. Ceausescu was in Washington in '78, I think, answering the visit by Richard Nixon in '69, and he was greeted by then President Carter. You are a great leader of a great nation. We've never heard this since then, which is something unbelievable. In between were allies, strong allies. We won together the Cold War. You agree? With some help of Radio Free Europe, I would say. Yep. With your direct help. Yep. Working hard in Poland with Solidarność, with the Catholic Church, and so on and so forth. We know all that. Not only that you've been as young as the Polish trade leaders in the opposition in the 80s, but you accompanied them, you worked hard with them for consolidating the democracy, lately as ambassador to Poland in 97, 2000, I think. Yeah. I think we have to keep in mind this broader context of the American-Romanian relations. We do not have other alternative. Our relation is too deep strategically and too naturally consolidated that we withdrawing easygoing conclusions about what happened to the American-Romanian relations during the last year, which is not, actually what happened in the last year is not encouraging this pessimistic overview either. I've just read that our foreign minister, my successor, will be visiting Washington for these rare earth minerals, which is something. We know that American troops are going to be withdrawn. At least it has been has been mentioned in the national strategy, security strategy, your strategy, Pentagon strategy as well. You are going to retire some Americans from our bases in MK, but not from Deveselu, where the shield missiles are still active. I suspect that there is some more Trump's love for Warsaw than for Bucharest. You can contradict me. We would very much like to be considered, as we are considering ourselves, equal only to the Poles within the Western flanks. So, like in Piłsudski's times. Poland has a tremendous evolution, military, political, economical, as we have behind us. It's a very important country, but still we are an important country. The Black Sea, with our position, the Black Sea, with our continuous role since decades, I think we proved to be consequent and reliable allies of the US. Starting with, I would put it this way, 1969, as President Nixon visited this country. We know all what communism meant. It was an awful period, but still, there was some openness towards the US, which was unique within the Eastern Bloc, which is not to be forgotten too easily, I would say, or erased. It meant something for us, for my generation. Before working for Radio Free Europe, for instance, for us it was essential to watch in the Romanian official communist TV channel American series, which has been not doubled, but we listen in English what they were saying in Dallas or so. In Hungary, in Poland, in all these countries, they just doubled. They put it with their actors' voices. And I remember being in the 70s, in the late 70s, as a high school student, and then as a university student, part of this public who was able to learn English instead of Russian, to learn German and French instead of compulsory Russian, which was the case in the other Eastern countries. All these were net benefits of our older generation, even during the communist times. Well, we all know what happened in the 80s. That was awful. We know what happened in the 90s. There was a dubious, ambiguous posterity of the Romanian Revolution in the first years. You know better than almost everyone here, from the inside, so to speak, knowledge. But nowadays, I think we are responsible, strategically important country, a good ally of the US, a needed presence militarily and politically in this part of Europe. And so we do not have so many reasons to be pessimistic. We always, in order to overcome this pessimism, we always have to have a broader context and to judge things and to put it on the mental map rather than on the present concrete map around us. Things are not as desperate as they could seem. I know you've been in Romania for some days, probably last Sunday. I've been following your interview with Radu Tudor, and I know the first question they put upon you was like, are you the American Midas? Everything we touch transformed in gold. So you met with a gold representative,
Right.
our representative, and your answer was admirable, I would say. There are new political trends in Europe. Partly, Europe is responsible for this political trend. They are local endogene phenomena. They are not imported. We have to take them into consideration. The democracy is a kind of fight, and so that after the fight or during the fight, new majorities or majorities are consolidating and obvious for everyone. It's just because of this, not against this backdrop, but because of this backdrop, we have to consolidate our democratic stamina and values, and to avoid considering ourselves kind of victims of the new strategic or geopolitical arrangements.
The last point you made, well, I'm in agreement with what you said. The last point you made is particularly important. Romanians themselves created the opportunities that have done so much good for this country. Romanians overthrew Ceausescu. Romanians, after a very difficult start after 1989, Romanians found the key to unlock prosperity and deepen democracy in this country, and have enjoyed a lot of success. Romanians are the authors of this. We helped, we Americans helped, but Romanians did the work, and Romanians succeeded. And it's important to remember that. It's also true, and this is another point you made that I agree with, we Americans and Romanians and Americans alike, need to remember the best lessons of the 20th century. Within the Trump administration and within the United States, we are re-debating the issues of America's role in the world, especially after the frustrating and difficult wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans questioned what America's role should be. And we're debating what the purposes and benefits of the free world. And you can see in the American debate all of the alternatives, spheres of influence, isolationism, fortress America, all of these ideas have been around in the United States and were around in the 20th century. And we Americans learned the hard way that Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points that you mentioned was right. That a free world order isn't charity, it serves America's best interests, and the genius of that strategy is that it works also for other countries working with us. We all benefit. And we've got to rediscover that. I also think you're right that Romania can be an anchor of security for Europe on this southeast part, just like Poland is in the northeast. Piłsudski was right that aggression from Russia requires the unity of the pro-Western countries in this part of Europe and the backup, as much as possible, of states in the West and the United States. And this is the challenge we face. I think it's in America's interest that Romania's voice is heard in Washington. Poland's voice is heard, but they shouldn't be, they can't be the only ones. Romania's strategic understanding of Europe, of Russia, of the need for the transatlantic alliance is strong and it runs deep. And Romania's voice should be heard. I remember 30 years ago, Mircea Joana, when he was the Romanian ambassador in Washington, said, look, you Americans will come to realize that Romania is as critical to European security as Poland. We get it, just like the Poles do. And I remember what he said, because I thought at the time, yeah, I think he's right. And it turns out he was absolutely right. And of course, he was hardly the only one. Romanians have been making this point, and they were correct. And we need to hear this Romanian voice. Now, it's also true that Romanian politics, let's say, is as divided as American politics, and there are all sorts of strategic options. And Romanians, especially transatlantic Romanians, like you, need to come to Washington and meet not just with transatlantic Americans like me, but you need to meet, maybe it's even more important for you to meet with the Americans who are more isolationist or Fortress America.
At least with the Reaganites.
Well, absolutely with the Reaganites, but you should also meet with the nationalists and the neo-isolationists to convince, so they're not hearing. I don't want them to hear only from their European counterparts. If I can be blunt and undiplomatic, I don't want them to hear only from Fidesz, okay, in Hungary. The people who are indifferent to Ukrainian security and sympathetic, it seems, to Kremlin ambitions. I want Romanians who have learned the lessons of the 20th century, I hope will be present in Washington and working with all of the Americans, including the ones that you may disagree with, to keep working on them.
I fully agree.
And we need those voices. Now, in Washington, Romania doesn't have enemies. It's got friends, people respect it, but it isn't well enough known. So I think a higher Romanian profile is a good thing. And Romania takes security seriously, despite the budgetary pressures that you're under. Romania is increasing its defense expenditures, and this is what the Trump administration wants. So you've got the opportunity to make your voices heard. I'm glad your foreign minister will be in Washington, and I hope lots of Romanians are over in Washington from all the political options, including especially the transatlantic ones. So this is, you talked about the cult of pessimism in this part of the world. And I know what you're talking about, sure. But Romanians made their own history. You opened the doors to NATO for yourselves. And you overthrew communism. And you built the prosperity that's incomplete but has made huge progress. And And we need that voice, the voice of Europeans who have made a miracle and believe in the transatlantic relationship and are willing to contribute to it. Because we're all in this together. We're all in this together. Putin is counting on us to despair and give up on our own best values. He's counting on that. And this time, we need to push back and defeat that mindset and turn back that threat. It means helping Ukraine. It means dealing with Russian aggression against us all. And it means maybe remembering, or maybe especially remembering our own best values that have brought us so far. And I kept thinking of your work at RFERL, right? That was a bad thing. Our Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty held up the torch of freedom and other possibilities for Europe other than communist occupation. And it worked out. It worked out. That's why I'm still of an optimistic frame of mind. Because I remember when in the United States, no one ever thought that the Iron Curtain would fall. No one ever thought that Romania would be free. We were taught in school that the Iron Curtain was forever, that Yalta Europe was the only possible Europe, and we had to be realistic. And that turned out not to be so.
I'd like to mention very respectfully the fact that you, in your well-known paper within the Atlantic Council, the democratic defense against disinformation,
Right.
authored together with Anna Polyakova in 2018,
Yeah.
second edition 2019. You mentioned the role of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty nowadays by 2018 and 2019, asking for more government support for these radios, for these outlets. Unfortunately, they are closed in between.
Yeah. Well, the Trump administration wanted to close them, and it has closed, or mostly closed, Voice of America. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's offices in Prague still work. They're still there. They have their difficulty. They've lost quite a bit of funding, but they are still working. And it is a mystery to me why the Trump administration took this position. I'm old enough that I remember when it was the American left that was skeptical of RFERL. And it was the Reaganites, it was the Republican Party that was enthusiastic about supporting it. And that seems to have shifted. But I hope when our heads stop spinning in the United States, our faces will be pointed in the right direction. It's interesting that you mention that, because during the Cold War, the United States tried all kinds of ways to push back on Soviet domination of Europe. And the ones that failed were the harder edged operations, dropping arms to anti-communist fighters in Albania, or even doing it in Poland in the early 1950s. Spectacular, embarrassing failures. What worked was what was called the soft stuff. RFERL was an example of a fabulous success, where we Americans were smart enough to just get out of the way and let Europeans, let Romanians be responsible for broadcasting to Romania, Poles to be responsible for broadcasting to Poland, Estonians in the case of our friend Tom Elvis, an
It
Estonian
was my
American,
neighbor and colleague in Munich by the time.
Right.
In the 80s, right.
and he later became president
Like,
of Estonia.
like Ron Asmus,
Yes,
who played a crucial role within the process of NATO expansion.
my friend Ron Asmus, part of that generation. Ron died too young. But this is a legacy that we need to remember and build on. We, the supporters of freedom, if I may put it that way, succeeded in the face of Soviet oppression, West European skepticism, and much American indifference. We now look back and think, oh, we were so clever and we were so successful, but it didn't feel that way at the time. And yet we succeeded. Which is why I agree with you that the cult of peasantism is just wrong. Of course, if I may say so, that's our generation, and it's our responsibility to teach the generation now in power and the young generation coming up these lessons, so they don't forget or they don't assume that the current skepticism is the only way forward. So we're dealing with tough challenges. Putin's aggression, his war against Ukraine, his aggression against Europe, and it's not just hybrid, it's sabotage, explosions, murder. But we've been there before. And this time, hopefully, the United States is not going to turn its back. And we will work with our Romanian friends, our Polish friends, and now with the West European governments who have discovered that, yeah, Moscow really is an adversary. We can do this. So, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It was great meeting you again in Bucharest. Good luck.
Minister? Thank you. Now, I believe it's my task to call to the stage the panel for a discussion of, I think it's counter disinformation and hybrid threats, which fits neatly into this discussion. So, you know who you are, so please come up. So this is a panel discussion on hybrid threats and disinformation. And I'm joined by people who really do know what they're talking about. Leaders in this, Julian Kifru, and we have known each other for decades and decades through a variety of interesting administrations in Washington and interesting governments in Bucharest. So it's a pleasure. Maria Manuela Catrina, who you have been working on cybersecurity. You've been responsible for it, for the policy. And you are now one of the people working in the non-governmental sector, advancing this cause, and may I say, alerting the West Europeans to this problem. Romania was first. Rina Stafuriat, also an expert in this space from the private sector, and really comes at this from the intersection of non-government civil society organizations and academia, and is part of, if I may say so, part of the generation of a free Romania and a Romania part of a free Europe. And the job of that generation is to make sure that this achievement is maintained in the face of pressure from without and challenges that we all face from within. So, Julian, I'd like to start with you. How do you see, we're facing Russian aggression in Ukraine, and Romania and Moldova have experienced this up close and personal, as we say. How do you want the United States, what do you want the United States to learn? What should we be alert for? What lessons have you learned that can improve our knowledge and our ability to resist this business?
Well, thank you very much. Tough question. Tough question, and I will try to do my 5 points, and I will go to the bottom and to the fundamentals, if you want, of democracy, the principles and values that we are sharing. Sorry, maybe in the previous discussion, one point was somehow missed, and I don't want to blame your generation, but actually, it's not a person from the young generation who's doing today the big mess and turning upside down the world. It's somebody from your generation or even older who didn't took the lessons of your generation, the ones that have been underlined here by Minister Guerrero and yourself. And here we can discuss, I don't want to blame anybody, but maybe if lessons would have been put at the right time for a larger stage, maybe we won't arrive here. So my first point is about the fundamentals. So elections versus free and fair elections. Fetishizing elections per se is not a solution. These are differences between the two sides of the Atlantic, and even I would not dare to say this because Canada and some other countries will blame me for that. But at least at this point, that's a fundamental difference. And we know the hard way, the fact that elections are not something absolute if they don't follow rules. We have seen elections here in Romania in communist time. We have seen elections, even we just passed the 24th of January, which is our union. Even in that time, we had annulment of the elections who were frauded. And it's a fundamental of our very existence as a modern state. We had the chance of making all the chancellery realize that this was a frauded elections that was aimed to block our reunification. I'm not talking about elections today, Russia, Belarus, that's not elections. So we can't put too much emphasis on that. My second point is about free speech. Freedom of speech, yes, you have it in amendment in the Constitution. We are cherishing it, but it is not limitless. It's not absolute. Freedom of speech comes also with a responsibility of the content of what we are speaking about. There are norms and rules and there are laws related to this, but it's even something more when we are talking about communities. Speech, content can split society, can fragment, can polarize, and we all know about that. I'm going to arrive to that because free speech comes with responsibility, not only for the person who say or write about an idea, but it's also responsibility for the networks, since the classical media is responsible The same should be for the social media, the new medias. A responsibility for the messages that are distributed to a wider public. It's not the responsibility of the consumer only, of its education, of everything coming with that, of literacy in this field, in informational warfare, to deal with this type of, and that's another big difference that we have. The third point is about this, and it is fundamental. Rules-based order versus power politics or big power policies. You know, spheres of influence, grabbing as much as you can. It's a difference of the substance of the values that we are sharing. My fourth point is about the liberties. It's a difference between considering that liberty is stopped where you are breaching the liberties of your fellow citizens in communities, and it's a completely different way of considering everybody should grab as much liberty as it can. So if I'm strong, I can do whatever. If he's weak, I don't care about his liberty. He couldn't take much of its own possibilities. So, and I can be just limited by my moral individual boundaries, as somebody put it. No, communities and limits of liberties are also an important matter of the differences of principles and values and of the democracy between the two parts of the Atlantic. And here I'm arriving to your question. We all know the Gerasimov strategy. Okay, just the name comes from the person, but it has been built on the fact that principles and values of democracies are vulnerabilities of the democratic system. So Gerasimov or his bosses at that time asked the Russian intelligence to build up instruments to take advantage on those vulnerabilities. So they consider each and every principle and value of democracy as a vulnerability because people in democracies are defending those principles. So it becomes a weakness and they build up those instruments to take advantage and they consider vulnerabilities our principles and values. It comes with a huge weakness, and that's my point. When a democratic country, the leader of the democratic world, the president, the most important person of the democratic world, comes in front and offers arguments, offers instruments, even echoing some of the information warfare phrases coming from Moscow. It is a big problem, and that creates another, I would put it even, rift between US and Europe in the fundamentals of democracy. And this enshrines also vulnerabilities and possibilities for Russia to take advantage on this hybrid warfare, especially the cognitive information warfare, but also the other parts of the spectrum, of the full spectrum warfare. And that would be my final point. We need also to bear a type of responsibility in what we are publicly saying and distributing and amplifying with the legitimacy of a position that is the most important and, by the way, the most applauded and cherished here in Romania. We consider still ourselves one of the most pro-American people in the region.
Okay, you've given us a lot to think about. Elections, free and otherwise, free speech versus responsibility, the example, for good or otherwise, of President Trump. So that's a lot. Okay, it's not going to be boring. Maria Manuela, what's your take on this? And how would you put the challenge of information warfare, disinformation, and the challenges the way I would put it is defending democracy and fighting the autocrats without becoming the autocrats.
Thank you. I will follow up on Julian's point because I think it is a great opening of the discussion. Starting with coming from the cyber field, saying that we learn, especially in Romania, definitely in many countries around the world, to build stronger shields. And our shields were high. So even if we speak about election, in election, the technical, they were not technical failures. It was a failure in a different area. But the problem that we face now is we forgotten to sharpen our spears, mainly because, especially in European countries, we have a scattered, let's say, geography of responsibilities in this field. Some civil institutions deal with, I don't know, cybersecurity in some areas. Disinformation, we don't know exactly who's in charge, exactly what's the contact point, what's the number of the people that are in charge of it. Hybrid threats are in a different silo. So in this geography, in that we don't have trenches anymore, but different seams. We opened the map to vulnerabilities because where we don't have covered the responsibility, we let the, let's say, malicious actors, be it states but not only, to interfere. And we opened the field. I think I can say that Romania was a little bit ahead. We knew that Russia is going to do something. So, and I remember an image in European format in that we are preparing for European election in 2024, and we are restarting the compendium on cyber security in elections. Because everybody said, oh, the things are closed, we know what's going on, there is no problem. And it was really a hard task to bring the hybrid threats in the cyber discussion because people are technical and saying hybrid is somewhere else. So we brought the European External Action Service on board in order to discuss about hybrid threats. And at that point, for everybody it was strange. Why Romania is speaking about that? Why do we feel that it is a threat about the European election? In the end, it showed that we had a good feeling, but maybe what we should learn about it is when we prepare for an invasion, you don't demine your fields, you put more mines in your fields. But we tend to level up the field because it's more easier to deal with it for various organizations, let's say so. So we tend to get the mines out before the election. That means we build ourselves some fragility that I know now we learn about it. And as Julian said, we had a wonderful woman that turned out the election in the 19th century when we rewrote the elections. So it was a very tough lesson that we had to learn. So, but getting from the lesson, I think mapping the field and mapping the vulnerability is something important, and do it with truthfully and testing it. Also, I think it's relevant in this equation. We talk not too much to the political actors. Election is about votes. The actors are political parties, are politicians. Unfortunately, because the field is so technical, many of them are not necessarily having the knowledge for dealing with this field. I would rather say sometimes the elephant is in the room is that they are there not because of their competence, but because incompetence sometimes was not a barrier to bring them there. So they take decision out of that. And when the pressure is there, the democratic forces have to pull together. And this reflex we need to train. And we are kind of reluctant to do it because people are not necessarily working together and sharing, I don't know, let's say how we do a disinformation campaign about my candidate, counter candidate. It's something that is considered maybe a secret, an election secret. But in the end, if there is a vulnerability, we miss it. And I will end saying that strategic ambiguity, it's now strategic liability. The diplomats like it in an ambiguous field, because you can say, is it attribution? Were they the Russians or not the Russians? I think we are in a point in that is becoming a liability, because attribution is in this moment the last step, and actually it should be the fourth step. And then we should have action plan, what we do after attribution, what measure we take, what sanctions we put, not only on countries, but on persons, on perpetrator, and so on and so forth, on platforms. So this should be the first step. Regulatory harmonization, I think it's important. In Europe, we speak about DSA and platforms. In the States, we speak about the First Amendment. We should find a common basis, especially for election. What is not doable? What is something that we shouldn't do, especially in the EA area? And we also should look on trust compared to votes, because actually the game is not about to win a battle, but not to lose the social immune system. And I think here, for sure, has more to say, because we measure election is good if we don't have incidents for the governmental party. We don't have incidents, it's good. And we always think short run, but the adversaries think long run. They say we diminish the credibility, we diminish democracy, and we have a long game. They look on destroying something, and we say, we didn't have a big problem, we had some attacks, okay, we deal with them. And it's okay. And it's not okay.
So, the First Amendment in the United States, the Digital Services Act in Europe, and the need to find a way bring these together and find a way forward that blunts Russia's efforts. Okay.
And not only Russians. I mean, there are other friends around the globe that play the same game.
Right.
So we should find a common denominator.
Okay. Remus, what's the practical way forward? And I'm going to sharpen the contradictions, as Lenin used to say. The Trump administration, that you refer to politely, hates the Digital Services Act. They think it's poison. They rail against it, and they refer, the State Department uses the phrase, the censorship industrial complex, to refer to the Digital Services Act and other efforts to go after disinformation. Given that polarization, what's the way forward?
Thank you for your question, and I will try to be very, very practical, and especially taking into account that we have a global audience, right? We will have the broadcasting of our discussion. I would refer especially to the Romanian case and bring arguments for a very practical approach.
Correct.
And I will describe, let's say, my last, from the perspective of a person that founded and coordinated in the last 15 years a polling company. So we have a lot of data regarding the public opinion. I will describe my last 7 days in 2024 before the election from November 24, when something happened in Romania. It was an attack on our democracy. I think it was one of the most, let's say, astonishing attack on any democracy in the world. And it's very important just to describe you my last 7 days, again, from the perspective of a person that is conducting surveys day by day, and we see some evolutions, and at the end of the day, we saw a result of the election. And then we will go to the practical arguments in the favor of, let's say, regulating these aspects. So, with 30 days before our election in 2024, we had the candidate that won the first round of the now elections. We can say his name, of course, Mr. Georgescu. His level of notoriety 30 days before the election was around 10%. 10. And his level of support, the percentage of vote was around 1-2%. 30 days before the election. Okay. After 2 weeks, we conducted, of course, regularly our surveys. We had an increase of his support. It was around 5-6%. So with 2 weeks before the election, he had 6% in our polls. Of course, there will be arguments that polls were wrong. No, they were not wrong, and I will bring the next argument. In the last week of the election, so I will start now with my last 7 days. So around, let's say, Tuesday, the last week of the election, the support for Mr. Georgescu increased to 11%. In any competition, in 3 weeks to come from 1 or 2% to 11% is huge, right? But still, 11%, right? So we knew that we had, and we still have a large base of voters that are resonating to more radical messages. So, okay, still normal times. Of course, we conducted also a survey during the voting day. And we published the survey before the release of the official results. And to my surprise, in the voting day, we received, let's say, partial data around 12 p.m. So after, let's say, 5-6 hours of votes, and when I saw the results, okay, Mr. Georgescu, 17%. Come on, we had 11. At the beginning of the campaign, we had 2%. 17% at 12 p.m. Of course, our final projection was for Mr. Georgescu 19 to close to 20. His final result in Romania was 21, with diaspora 23%. So we conducted the polls with the same methodology, so the polls were not wrong. And then, of course, we have, let's say, the next facts. Let's analyze, for example, his campaign on TikTok, which is very, very relevant. Imagine that this type of candidate had the total number of views for any message, let's say, on TikTok supporting Mr. Georgescu was around 400 million views in the last 2 months until the election. So 400 million views. In the first 50 days, the number of views for his messages was around 100 million. So in the first 50 days. In the last 7 days, the total number of views for his messages was around 300 million. And in the last 3 days, including the voting day and the day before the voting day, which you shouldn't, of course, conduct electoral campaigns, the total number of views for his campaign was around 200 million views. So in the last 3 days, we had an increase of more than 30 times of views compared with the number of views in the beginning of his campaign. Of course, after this, it was a press release, of course, a month after, from TikTok explaining the mechanism. It's part of, let's say, the official inquiry. I will not go into that. And I will end this question with one fact that it was really striking for me. So I conducted my PhD thesis was focused on Soviet active measures. I finalized my PhD in 2011. I went back to my notes, to my PhD thesis, to see if during the Soviet time there was the first chief directorate, which was the equivalent now of the SDR in Russian times. I never encountered any press release from the first chief directorate to support any candidate in any democratic regime before 1999. No press release. But surprise, surprise, surprise for us, surprise probably for our global audience, we had a press release from SVR supporting Mr. Georgescu. I don't know if any of us have ever heard of a press release of an espionage agency in support of a candidate from a country, from a NATO country, from an EU country. And then, of course, after this complicated journey, we see now a political party, we have to talk about this, who is going to US, and he's talking, this party have, of course, has several messages. He's trying to have an approach on, let's say, more nationalistic currents in US politics. But on the other hand, they are talking about the fact that the annulment of these elections, with all the stories that I mentioned, was an attack on our democracy, which is, of course, the key narrative of Russian propaganda. The same type of party is fueling a strong campaign against Ukraine in Romania and for a larger audience, taking into account that, let's say, defending Ukraine, it's on our key national interest. So, now moving on your initial question. When we have all these facts, how should the democracy, a Romanian democracy, an European democracy, an American democracy, should be protected? What type of instruments should use in order to defend itself in the face of such an aggressive campaign, which was using sophisticated tools in order, again, to have this type of increase in visibility from 0 to 100 million of views, from 2% to 23% in 30 days. What type of instruments should we use when the same instruments are used against our democracies? Romanian democracy, European democracy, US democracy. I'm just raising this type of question because if let's say, regulation on this field are perceived as an attack against democracy, how should we deal with attacks on democracy, attacks clearly coordinated by a hostile state? Again, it's not coverted anymore. I mean, SVR issued, again, I don't know if it's clear or not, SVR issued a press release supporting this type of candidate. It's not covered. It's just an open, it's just an open support. And again, I'm just raising, how should we protect our democracy?
It is a precedent, but it has succession. We had 3 SVR communiques for the general elections in Republic of Moldova.
You're right.
Against Maya Sandu.
Again, the Soviets in the past didn't issue any press release, even if, of course, they conducted operation against, let's say, candidates in democratic countries or supported different type of candidates in European democracies and even in US during the Cold War.
Well, let me put the question to you then, and to any of the others. So I'm familiar with the statistics behind Georgescu's rise. Was that an operation? And how did that operation work? And what made it possible for that operation to work? Elections are full of surprises. It's never a good thing when this happens. But what was the balance of responsibility between, the rise was the rise fake? Was it caused by, was there ballot fraud, or was there a successful information operation?
I have 2 answers for your question. First of all, of course, the rise of such a candidate and the success of such a campaign wouldn't have been possible without, let's say, the proper social environment, let's say, dominated by unhappiness, dominated by economical frustration of the population, and dominated by, let's say, political actors, candidates from the mainstream party, which were not, let's say, the best options in terms of that specific context and in terms of, let's say, the level of trust from the public. On the other hand, we are not talking about only about a targeted operation on, let's say, the last month before the presidential election. We documented this with several reports. We conducted, for example, several surveys in a project coordinated by the German Marshall Fund. We also have a platform, a media intelligence platform, Newsvibe.ro, which is investigating different type of conversation. And we can say definitely that in the last 10 years, let's say the Russian propaganda supporting, for example, nostalgia about communism regime, fueling polarization, highlighting topics that were not maybe on the mainstream, but topics that are, let's say, subversive towards Romanian audience, also played a role in framing this type of campaign. So, internal explanations, again, economical and social frustration, political actors, counter candidates of Mr. Georgescu, which were not fit to run in such a race, in such a context, very troubled context. And on the other hand, again, a long-term campaign, disinformation campaign, initiated, of course, by Russia, not only in Romania, in the entire Europe, and especially in the central and eastern part of Europe.
If I may, I will just enforce what already Remus has said with what we know, and the full report will happen. Hopefully, we will learn about it sooner by the president, and for sure when the file is going to leave the preliminary chamber and enter into the trial. In that case, yes, environment played a game. Second, we also had some political, I would put it, apprentice wizards trying to make creative strategies, moving votes around and preparing for a second round that would be advantageous for one or another of the players, not talking on internal self-attacks and sabotage in another party. So, but the most important part comes from, first, financial support, which was zero notified, but was enormous in terms of involvement in the social media, specifically TikTok. Second, and which breaches, it's another difference that I didn't mention, the financial part. In our case, in our states, we are controlling the financial part of involvement in such a way that we have balanced elections and not somebody who buys the elections from the electorate. In the case of the US, as much as you can grab and make from the citizens, it's okay. But in the financial part, we have very strict rules because the state reimburses, according to the results, the costs of the campaign. It hasn't been followed by Georgescu and his crew and people behind him. Second, it's about the rules of the social media. As you know, in the case of all the social media, but even in TikTok, it is said that any electoral candidate should be labeled as such and blocked in the so naturally communicating the message not being amplified by man. It didn't happen for Georgescu. Georgescu was never labeled as all the other, as being a candidate, and it had an artificial impetus in the whole network that was against the rules of the correct competition. And the third point, you are very much aware because we've discussed days after the elections directly, it's the complex and sophisticated psychological operation with number of citizens that were left behind, ignored, and it has passed by the dependency, guru type of hope and radicalization, which prompted the 200,000 people, soldiers of that candidate that have done the manpower for amplification of the signals in some other networks, not in TikTok, was out of the signature and agreement with voluntary agreement with the Commission a year before. And just one little point, TikTok entered due to EU intervention during last year, 2025. It signs the agreement, it volunteers to follow the rules. And I can tell you that the last 7 days of the Republic of Moldova elections, it disregards its commitment and engagement and contract with the EU. So it didn't put down the messages according to the procedures and the mechanism established with the state that had elections.
I was trying to add an image that doesn't come from the technical field, but trying to model it in a way. Usually when we speak about disinformation campaign, we try to find an image of the murmuration of the words. But I think for what happened in Romania, a better image is the biblical locust plague. Because usually locusts, most of the time, they are on their own, living alone, and they don't feed on our crops for many times. At some point, during the environmental conditions or something intervening on the environment, they start together. Usually they are individuals, but suddenly they start together in groups. What happens in the moment that they gather in groups? It's something that it managed to bring the group move in one direction, because usually the groups move chaotic. How we make this type of information that happens around to move in one direction? For the locust is cannibalism. Suddenly they produce a substance that makes each other locust interesting, and so every locust try to eat the locust in front of it and try to protect its back. So the wave moves, but in the same time, because evolution is great, they also produce a protein that start to say, "Hey, I'm not food." So this is part of the evolution, and this type of protein is produced. Sometimes the movement doesn't happen, but if the movement starts and you gather already the locust, it's almost impossible to stop it. So if we think about social networks, we have to think about inventing not necessarily censorship, because I grew in a part of communist Romania. I love Radio Free Europe, and I'm against censorship per se. But build in the system, let's say, commentators, stops, so that these gatherings are not happening. Because after the gathering happened, no matter in that last 3 days, I don't think something we could make to stop the wave, because it's already formed. And on the other part, and I think we have to say it to be honest and look in the mirror, we ignored for much time TikTok because it was illegal to enter. So many public institutions, many politicians were not there because we told them, "Hey, you shouldn't be there, it's illegal." But the people that are there, it was a decision. It was an official decision of the National Security Council, so it's not. But this decision take the good guys from TikTok and let the small locusts together playing around, and when we enter in the field, we don't know the field as much as we know it. But I'm stopping here. I just like the image because I think it fits better with what happens.
Well, I hear what you're saying. a plague of locusts is one way to put it, and that's a vivid image. Never a good thing when a democratic country finds itself in such a position, and not a good thing when an election result is annulled. Going forward, I mean, Romania has had free and fair elections since then. And it's got kind of a regular political climate with opposition parties and tussles within the coalition. I mean, that's pretty normal, basic standard European stuff. But that was a sharp lesson. And how confident are you that the plague of locusts won't return and that you've got the systems in place for elections, changes of government, peaceful transition of power? And I mention this, look, as an American, I'm going to say it before somebody else reminds me that in the United States, elections are now, and the conduct of elections are now a contested issue. With President Trump calling for nationalization, that is federalization of the election process, which under the US Constitution is supposed to be in the states. So Romania is not the only one that is debating free and fair elections. Hardly. We did this in 2020. So we're all in this together. In the meantime, Moldova, a much smaller and in many ways more vulnerable country, has had 2 elections where the Russians were doing their best to interfere, and they failed both times. Maria Sandu won soundly, and the, let's say, liberal political parties or transatlantic political parties won also free and fair elections in the face of Russian interference. How do they do that? What are the lessons that we can all learn from this? Because this is not an abstract debate. This is like here and now for real stuff.
Well, if I may, first, the general theoretical approach. Democracies do not have a break. We don't have any mechanism that when such attack emerges, and I'm sorry, it will happen again in a different way. You don't have any guarantees, and as usual, the perpetrator goes always ahead of the defense of the defense and of the securitization of the state. It will happen again. So we don't have a break in democracy. That's why we had to arrive at the annulment elections. We didn't have the possibility to intervene before the elections when, as Remus has underlined, you see that something is fishy. Second, I very much like the image of the locust, but I will go somewhere which is deeper and maybe it hurts more. Afghanistan. Living in Afghanistan when Taliban wave begin to reverse and to go against us. When they couldn't, and it couldn't happen that 31st of August will happen as established in the agreement, but the regime fall and we had this type of chaos in Kabul on the 16th, 17th of August. Because the Taliban entered, because the defenses failed, because everybody knew that it's going to happen, and the deadline was not observed with everything that this means. You didn't have the possibility of hitting the brake once the wave began. So it's very important. Now, let me go to the Republic of Moldova. And I will separate the trends because parliamentarian elections meant involvement of all the democratic states there, Romania and so on, assisting Republic of Moldova institutions, everything in dealing what happened. And the type of involvement was less in cognitive information warfare because they already have reserves that at the limits, having even a president doing, the spectacle related to what Putin has done. So they needed to intervene with something else, which was money and buying votes. And here, the intervention happened, and we did have deterrence and arrests and exposure and everything else. That's the second elections last year, general elections. But in the first elections, in the first round, with the referendum for EU, actually for introducing in the constitution the EU law, we were barely succeeded in making it happen. It was also general support for the Republic of Moldova coming from all the countries, especially from Romania. And that, some say, cost Romania the intervention, because looking at what we have as instruments, each and every state is subject to such type of attack. And everything was on the field prepared to do that. Previous intervention did happen since 2016. French elections, German elections, you name it. And at this moment, it was the decision to move against Romania because they block our possibility to do it in the first round and referendum for Republic of Moldova. So it was a type of payback. We need to take the lessons learned, and at that time we sent people all over in all the capitals to explain, to put on the table, to announce and to consult our partners and allies that this is happening and will happen to any one of us. That's how it has been done. So it is an instrument that Russia still has. It's less effective because they use it once, but the creativity, inventivity, and all the others will help them find a way for a next round sometime when they will need it.
I think also adding to you, I think at the moment is why Romania is better, because in that moment, not only the conditions in Romania were, let's say, favorable, but also the technology was more mature. We are just getting two waves working together, because we have this rise of AI that makes the possibility of targeting directly, micro-targeting, and this type of things. That I don't think the same solution can be applied twice. It doesn't work like that. We have to assume that this type of breaches will appear, and we have to prepare for it. And also, we should, I believe we should take transparency as part of our security. We should learn